She was cast out on her wedding day. But 10 years later, she returned in a wedding dress and shocked them all. The farmhouse hall fell silent as a tomb when she walked through those doors. There she stood, 10 years later, wearing the same yellowed wedding dress that had witnessed her deepest humiliation. Her brother's face went white as a sheet. The coward who'd rejected her couldn't meet her eyes, and the whole town held its breath. But honey, what nobody expected was what she pulled from that traveling bag. Documents that would expose the lies that destroyed her life and shock every soul in that room. This wasn't the broken girl they'd cast out. This was a woman who'd returned to reclaim not just her inheritance, but the truth they'd tried to bury forever. Now listen here, you're gonna hear a story that'll break your heart wide open, but I promise you, it's worth every tear you're gonna shed. This here's about a woman named Clara May, and honey, what happened to her on what should have been the happiest day of her life? Well, it's something that'll stick with you forever. Picture this. Summer of 1895, out in the rolling hills of Virginia. The old Henderson farmhouse was all lit up like Christmas morning, with lanterns hanging from every porch beam and wildflowers decorating every corner you could imagine. Folks were arriving in their finest horse-drawn carriages, the ladies wearing their prettiest linen dresses and sun hats, the gentlemen in their Sunday best suits despite the heat. Clara May, oh my lord, she was glowing like an angel in her mama's hand-stitched wedding gown. That dress had been passed down through 3 generations, made of the finest white silk you ever did see. She walked toward that makeshift altar they'd set up in the Great Hall, her heart beating so fast she thought it might just burst right out of her chest. There stood Thomas Mitchell, the town's most respected merchant, handsome as the day is long and nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm. Everyone said they made the perfect couple. Him with his successful grain business, her with the family farm that stretched for miles. But then, honey, everything went to pieces faster than you could blink. Clara May's older brother, Samuel, came storming through those doors like the devil himself was chasing him. His face was red as a tomato, and he was hollering about family honor and shame loud enough to wake the dead. Right behind him was that smooth-talking lawyer, Mr. Whitmore, waving around some papers and whispering poison into everyone's ears. "This woman has brought disgrace to our family name," Samuel shouted, pointing his finger at his own sister, like she was some kind of criminal. Poor Clara May just stood there, her bouquet of daisies trembling in her hands. "Samuel, what are you talking about? What papers?" But Thomas, oh that coward, he took one look at those papers, one listen to the whispers, and his face went white as a sheet. The pressure from the whole community, the fear of losing his precious reputation, it was too much for his weak heart. I can't marry you, Clara May," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry." Right there in front of God and everybody, he rejected her. Can you imagine? The woman he'd been courting for 2 years, who he'd promised to love and cherish, cast aside like yesterday's newspaper. Clara May's world came crashing down around her ears. The wedding guests gasped and whispered, some covering their mouths in shock, others shaking their heads in judgment. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of disapproving faces. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks, "somebody tell me what's happening." But nobody would meet her eyes. Her own brother grabbed her arm and pushed her toward the door. "You've done enough damage for one day." And just like that, Clara May Henderson, who should have been Mrs. Thomas Mitchell by sunset, was cast out of her own home, her white wedding dress trailing in the dirt, while the whole town watched and whispered about her shame. But here's the thing, sugar. What nobody in that farmhouse could have guessed was that this wasn't the end of Clara May's story. No, sir. It was just the beginning of something that would shock them all to their very core. Now, honey, if you thought that wedding day was the worst of it, you ain't heard nothing yet. What happened next would test Clara May's spirit in ways that would break most folks clean in half. The very next morning, Samuel came knocking at her bedroom door with legal papers in his hand and ice in his heart. "Pack your things, Clara May. You got 1 hour." "Samuel, this is my home too," she pleaded, still wearing that wrinkled wedding dress because she couldn't bear to take it off. "Daddy left this farm to both of us." But her brother, he'd already made up his mind. "Those papers Mr. Whitmore showed us, they prove you ain't fit to own Henderson land. Now pack." With shaking hands, Clara May stuffed her few belongings into Mama's old leather suitcase, some dresses, her Bible, and that ruined wedding gown. Everything else, every memory, every piece of her life, she had to leave behind. Thomas Mitchell. That coward never came to see her, never tried to make things right. Word around town was he'd already started courting the banker's daughter, like Clara May had never existed at all. The townspeople, oh Lord, they were cruel in that special way small-town folks can be. Everywhere she walked, whispers followed like shadows. "There goes the rejected bride," they'd say, shaking their heads. Poor thing brought shame on the whole Henderson name. Mrs. Patterson from the general store wouldn't even sell her supplies. "Sorry, dear, but I can't be seen helping someone who's—" Well, you understand. Clara May's heart broke a little more each day. She'd grown up with these people, gone to church service with them, shared meals at community gatherings. Now they treated her like she had some kind of disease. With nowhere else to go, she took what little money she had saved and bought a train ticket to Richmond, about 100 miles away. Far enough that nobody would know her story, but close enough that she could maybe, someday, find her way back home. Richmond was a hard, lonely place for a woman with no family and no reputation. She found herself a tiny room in Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house, barely big enough for a bed and a washstand, but it was all she could afford. Every morning before dawn, Clara May would walk down to the James River, where the wealthy ladies brought their fine linens to be washed. Her hands, once soft from farm life, quickly became rough and cracked from the harsh soap and cold water. She'd scrub those clothes until her back ached something fierce, earning just enough coins to pay for her room and a simple meal. Evenings, she'd work in different kitchens around town, cooking for families who never bothered to learn her name. "Girl," they'd call her, "make sure that stew don't burn." Every meal she earned came through pure sweat and tears that she'd cry into her pillow each night. The silence of exile was the hardest part. No familiar voices calling her name, no family Sunday dinners, no friends stopping by to chat, just the endless sound of scrubbing and chopping and the lonely echo of her footsteps in that empty boarding house room. But here's what nobody knew, what Clara May herself didn't even realize at first. All that suffering, all that pain, it was shaping something inside her stronger than steel. In that ground of sorrow, she was discovering something greater than shame. Now, while poor Clara May was scrubbing clothes down by that cold river in Richmond, let me tell you what was happening back home at the Henderson farm. And honey, it ain't gonna sit well with you, not one bit. Samuel Henderson had himself a real transformation, and not the good kind. Within just 6 months of casting out his own sister, folks around town started calling him Colonel Henderson. Now, he never served in any army, mind you, but money has a way of buying respect, even when it ain't deserved. That Henderson farm, Lord have mercy, it was booming like nobody's business. The corn grew taller than anyone had ever seen, the wheat fields stretched golden as far as the eye could see, and Samuel was making more money than his daddy ever dreamed of. He expanded the property, bought up neighboring farms when folks couldn't pay their debts, and that big farmhouse became the fanciest place in the whole county. Every Saturday night, Samuel would throw these grand dinner parties. The dining room table would be loaded down with roast beef, fresh bread, and all kinds of fancy foods. The town's most important people would come calling. The mayor, the judge, even the railroad men from the capital. They'd sit around that table smoking cigars and talking business deals, treating Samuel like he was some kind of king. "Colonel Henderson," they'd say, "you sure know how to run a profitable operation." And Samuel, he'd puff up his chest and smile real wide, but late at night when all the guests went home and the house got quiet, something else would creep into his mind, something that wouldn't leave him be. See, deep down in his heart, Samuel knew the truth. He knew those papers Mr. Whitmore had shown him that day weren't quite right. He knew he'd exaggerated things about Clara May, maybe even lied a little. The lawyer had been real convincing, talking about protecting the family reputation and securing the future, but now Samuel was starting to wonder if he'd been played for a fool. Every time he walked past Clara May's old bedroom, now turned into his fancy office, he'd feel this heavy weight in his chest. When he sat in Daddy's old chair at the head of that dining table, he could almost hear his sister's laugh echoing from when they were children, back when they actually loved each other. But pride, honey, pride is a terrible thing. It can make a man do awful things and then keep him from making them right. Samuel's pride wouldn't let him admit he might have been wrong. No, sir. He'd built his whole new life on the story that Clara May had shamed the family, and admitting the truth now would mean losing everything. The townspeople, they weren't stupid though. They had eyes and ears, and they talked. In whispers at the general store over coffee after church service, they'd say things like, "That farm sure is prosperous, built right on top of his sister's heartbreak. Colonel Henderson's got everything now," Mrs. Patterson would mutter. "Everything that belonged to that poor girl too." But Samuel, he pretended not to hear. He kept throwing his parties, kept making his money, kept playing the part of the successful landowner. Still, every night when he'd count his profits, Every morning when he'd survey his fields, there was this nagging feeling that wouldn't go away. The fuller his barns became, the more he felt like something was coming, like the past wasn't done with him yet, like somewhere out there, the truth was just waiting to come back and demand payment for what he'd done to his own flesh and blood. Now, honey, while Samuel was living high on the hog back home, Clara May was learning what real hardship looked like. And let me tell you, it was going to break her down before it built her up. That first winter in Richmond was brutal. The boarding house was cold as a tomb, and Clara May's tiny room had cracks in the walls that let the wind whistle through like a banshee. She'd wake up some mornings with frost on her blanket, shivering so hard her teeth would chatter like castanets. The washing work by the river got even harder when the weather turned. Her hands would go numb in that icy water, but she couldn't stop. Stopping meant no money, and no money meant no food. Those fine ladies' clothes had to be cleaned, frozen fingers or not. But washing wasn't the only work Clara May had to take. Come harvest season, she'd walk miles out to the cotton fields, bending over those plants from sunup to sundown, her back screaming in pain. The overseer was a hard man who didn't care that she was educated or that she used to own land. "Move faster, girl," he'd bark. "Cotton ain't gonna pick itself." Evenings, Clara May would bake pies in Mrs. O'Malley's kitchen, apple, peach, whatever fruit she could afford, then walk them over to the county fair on weekends. Standing there in the heat, trying to sell those pies to folks who looked right through her like she was invisible, that was its own kind of suffering. "How much for the apple pie, dear?" a well-dressed lady would ask. 15 cents, ma'am," Clara May would answer politely. "Oh my, that's quite expensive for someone like you making them. Someone like you." Those words cut deeper than any knife. The wealthy families in the fancy part of Richmond would hire her to haul water buckets from their wells to their gardens, bucket after bucket, her shoulders aching, sweat pouring down her face. Some days she'd carry so much water she felt like she might just collapse right there in their flower beds. But you know what, sugar? Something else was happening during all this suffering, something beautiful and powerful that nobody could see from the outside. Clara May started attending services at this little wooden church on the poor side of town. Pastor Williams was a kind man with gentle eyes who didn't care that she wore the same worn dress every Sunday. He saw something in Clara May that she was just beginning to see in herself. "Child," he said to her one day after service, "you got a sharp mind. How about I teach you to read and write proper?" See, Clara May could read a little from her mama's Bible, but writing was something only the wealthy folks' children learned. But Pastor Williams, he spent hours with her after his sermons, teaching her letters and words and how to put thoughts down on paper. "Knowledge is power," he'd tell her, "and someday, Clara May, you're gonna need that power." Those calloused hands that scrubbed clothes and picked cotton, they were also learning to hold a pen. That mind that worried about money and food, it was also storing up wisdom and scripture and hope. While Samuel was counting his money back in Virginia, Clara May was gathering something much more valuable. She was building strength that couldn't be bought or sold, faith that couldn't be shaken, and knowledge that would serve her well. And there, between her tears and her prayers, something incredible was happening. Clara May Henderson was preparing for a return that no one, not Samuel, not Thomas, not even she herself, thought was possible. Now, honey, while Clara May was building her strength and Samuel was wrestling with his conscience, there was someone else in this story who was sleeping just fine at night, and that someone was the real villain of this whole mess, Mr. Whitmore, the family lawyer. Let me paint you a picture of this man, because on the outside he looked like everything decent and respectable. Mr. Whitmore wore the finest suits money could buy, pressed and clean as a Sunday morning. His voice was smooth as honey, educated and proper, the kind that made folks think he must be telling the truth. With his silver hair slicked back and those wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose, he looked every inch the scholarly gentleman. Everywhere, Mr. Whitmore went in town, doors opened for him. The mayor would tip his hat, the banker would shake his hand, and the ladies at church socials would hang on his every word. "Such a learned man," they'd whisper, "so well-read and trustworthy." But behind that polished mask, sugar was a heart as black as coal. See, Mr. Whitmore had been playing a long game with the Henderson family for years. When old Mr. Henderson was sick and dying, the lawyer had been right there at his bedside, helping him write his will. But what nobody knew was that Whitmore had been forging documents, changing numbers, and setting up schemes that would make him rich once the old man was gone. The papers he'd shown Samuel that terrible wedding day. Pure lies, every word. He'd made up stories about Clara May bringing shame to the family, created fake debts and false accusations. All so he could convince Samuel to take full control of the farm, with Whitmore as his business partner, of course. But the real evil, the thing that would make your blood boil, was what he'd done to poor Thomas Mitchell months before the wedding. Whitmore had gone to that weak-willed man and filled his head with poison. "Thomas, my boy," he'd said in that smooth voice, "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there are things about Clara May you should know. Questions about her character, her fitness to be a merchant's wife." He'd planted seeds of doubt, little whispers and suggestions that grew in Thomas's mind like weeds. By the wedding day, Thomas was already half convinced that Clara May wasn't worthy of him. When those fake papers appeared, it was just the excuse he needed to run. All the while, Whitmore was making money hand over fist. He'd convinced Samuel to invest in bogus railroad deals, charged him enormous legal fees for protecting the family interests, and even skimmed profits from the farm's sales. The Henderson fortune was filling Whitmore's pockets while he played the part of the faithful family advisor. The man was so confident in his scheme, so sure that nobody would ever question him, that he got sloppy. He kept copies of everything in his office safe, the real will, the forged documents, even letters proving his lies about Clara May. He thought he was untouchable. Who would believe a disgraced woman over a respected lawyer? He chuckled to himself while counting his ill-gotten money. At the town's social gatherings, Whitmore would even express sympathy for poor Samuel, having to deal with his sister's disgrace. The hypocrisy was sickening, but nobody saw through his act. But here's the thing about lies, honey. They might fool people for a while, but truth has a way of fighting back. And somewhere in Richmond, a young woman was learning to read and write, gaining knowledge and wisdom that would soon be put to very good use. Mr. Whitmore thought his shadow of deception would never be touched by light, but he was about to learn that some shadows can't hide forever. 10 long years had passed, honey, and let me tell you, the world had changed plenty. New railroad tracks crisscrossed the Virginia countryside, telegraph wires stretched between towns, and the Henderson farm had grown into one of the biggest operations in 3 counties. Trade was booming with grain shipments and livestock deals, but some things stay buried in a town's memory forever. It was a crisp October morning in 1905 when that plain wooden carriage came rolling down Main Street. Folks were going about their business. Mrs. Patterson sweeping her store steps, the blacksmith hammering away, children walking to the schoolhouse. Then somebody spotted that carriage and everything just stopped. The driver was a stranger, but the woman sitting in the back seat, oh my lord, every soul in that town knew exactly who she was. Even after all those years, Clara May Henderson had come home. But here's what made everybody's jaw drop clean to the ground. She was wearing that wedding dress. The same hand-stitched white gown from 10 years ago, now yellowed with age but carefully mended and restored. Every lace detail had been preserved, every pearl button polished to shine. Now some folks might think that was crazy, wearing a decade-old wedding dress like some kind of ghost from the past. But Clara May wasn't crazy, not one bit. That dress was a symbol, sugar, a powerful statement that said, "I refuse to be ashamed anymore." "Good heavens," whispered Mrs. Patterson, dropping her broom. "It's her, it's the rejected bride." Word spread through that town faster than wildfire. People came rushing out of shops and houses, gathering in the dirt streets, pointing and whispering behind their hands. Some crossed themselves and muttered prayers like they were seeing a spirit return from the grave. Clara May Henderson, after all these years. Look at that dress, still wearing her wedding gown. What in tarnation is she doing back here? Up at the big house, Samuel was in his fancy office counting money from his latest grain deal when his foreman came bursting through the door, white as a sheet. "Colonel Henderson, sir. You need to see this." Samuel walked out onto his grand front porch, the same porch where he used to sit with Clara May when they were children, sharing secrets and dreams. When he saw that carriage, when he saw his sister in that wedding dress, his heart started pounding so hard he thought it might burst right out of his chest. All the guilt he'd been carrying, all those sleepless nights wondering if he'd done wrong, came crashing down on him like a ton of bricks. His hands started shaking and he had to grip the porch railing to keep from falling over. Down at Mitchell's general store, Thomas was helping a customer when someone shouted the news. He dropped the bag of flour he was holding, sending white powder everywhere. 10 years older now, with lines around his eyes and grey streaking his hair, he stood there frozen like a statue. The customer kept talking, but Thomas couldn't hear a word. All he could hear was the echo of his own voice from that terrible day. "I can't marry you, Clara May. The regret he'd carried like a stone in his chest for 10 years suddenly felt heavy enough to crush him. Clara May's carriage stopped right in the center of town, in front of the very church where she should have been married. She stepped down slowly, gracefully, that yellowed wedding dress rustling in the autumn breeze. Her head was held high, her back straight, and there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Strength, wisdom, and a quiet power that made even the loudest whispers die away. She wasn't the broken young woman they'd cast out. This was someone new, someone transformed by suffering into something stronger than they could imagine. But honey, it wasn't just the dress she'd brought back to that little town. Hidden in her traveling bag were documents, letters, and proof of things that would shake the very foundations of everything they thought they knew. Now, honey, what happened next was something that town would talk about for generations. Word had spread like wildfire that Clara May wanted to speak to everyone in the same place where her world had fallen apart 10 years ago, the grand hall of the Henderson farmhouse. By evening, that hall was packed tighter than a can of sardines. Folks came from miles around, some out of curiosity, some out of guilt, and some just hoping to witness whatever was about to unfold. The mayor was there, the judge, the banker, even families who hadn't spoken to each other in years put aside their differences to come see this. Samuel had tried to refuse, but Clara May had sent word through Pastor Williams. "Tell my brother I'm coming whether he likes it or not. This is still my daddy's house, and I have every right to speak my piece." The same grand hall that had been decorated with flowers and ribbons for a wedding now felt heavy with tension. The walls seemed to remember that terrible day, and the very air crackled with anticipation. People whispered behind their hands, wondering what Clara May could possibly have to say after all these years. When the big oak doors opened and Clara May walked in, the room fell silent as a tomb. That yellowed wedding dress rustled against the wooden floor, and every step she took echoed like a drumbeat. Her head was held high, her shoulders straight, and there was something in her bearing that commanded respect. Samuel sat in Daddy's old chair at the head of the room, but he looked smaller somehow, diminished. His hands gripped the armrest so tight his knuckles had gone white, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. The guilt he'd been carrying was written all over his face like words on a page. Thomas Mitchell stood near the back wall, pale as a ghost, trying his best to avoid Clara May's eyes. The years hadn't been kind to him. His hair was mostly grey now, and deep lines of regret had carved themselves around his mouth. He kept shifting from foot to foot like he wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't carry him. Mr. Whitmore sat in the front row, looking calm and collected as always. But if you watched real close, you could see his jaw twitching just a little, and his eyes never left Clara May's face. The room buzzed with whispers, hundreds of voices creating a low hum of anticipation and judgment. Some folks looked sympathetic, remembering the sweet girl Clara May had been. Others wore expressions of suspicion, still believing the lies they'd been told. Then, Clara May reached the center of the room, the exact spot where she'd stood in this same dress 10 years ago. She turned slowly, taking in every face, every expression, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear, carrying to every corner of that packed hall. "Folks, I know what y'all are thinking. You're wondering why I'm here, why I'm wearing this dress, why I've come back after all these years." She paused, and you could have heard a pin drop. "I want you to know, I didn't come back for revenge. I didn't come back to cause trouble or settle old scores. I came back for something much more important than that." Another pause, and Samuel's breathing got heavier. "I came back for the truth." And honey, when those words left her lips, something shifted in that room. The air got thicker, the whispers stopped, and everybody leaned forward just a little, sensing that whatever came next was going to change everything they thought they knew about that terrible day 10 years ago. Now, honey, what happened next was going to shake that room to its very foundation. Clara May reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a stack of papers, letters, and documents that made Mr. Whitmore's face go white as fresh snow. 10 years ago, Clara May said, her voice carrying clear as a bell, "I was cast out based on lies. Today, I'm going to show you all the truth." She held up the first document, and even from the back of the room, folks could see it was official looking, with seals and signatures. "This here is my daddy's real will, written in his own hand, the one Mr. Whitmore never wanted anyone to see." Samuel shot forward in his chair like he'd been struck by lightning. "What are you talking about? I have Daddy's will right here in my office." "What you have, brother, is a forgery." Clara May's words hit that room like thunder. "This real will says the farm was to be split equal between us. with you managing the business and me keeping the house and half the profits." The crowd gasped, and Samuel's face went through about 6 different shades of pale. All those years he'd been telling himself he was protecting the family honor, and it had all been built on lies. But Clara May wasn't done. She pulled out a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "These are letters between Mr. Whitmore and Thomas, written before our wedding. Thomas, would you like to tell everyone what's in them, or should I?" Thomas Mitchell looked like he was going to be sick right there on the spot. His hands shook as he stammered, "Clara May, I don't know what you're talking about." "Then let me refresh your memory." She opened one of the letters and read aloud, "My dear Thomas, I've discovered some disturbing information about Miss Henderson's character that you should know before the wedding." The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Mrs. Patterson covered her mouth with her hand, and the judge leaned forward, suddenly very interested. Clara May continued reading, "I have it on good authority that she has been meeting secretly with unsuitable men, compromising her reputation and the family name." "That's a lie," Thomas burst out, his voice cracking. "You never, Clara May, you were as pure as the driven snow and I knew it. But he convinced me, he filled my head with doubts." Tears were streaming down Thomas's face now, 10 years of guilt finally pouring out. "He told me if I married you, my business would suffer, that people would talk. I was a coward, Clara May, a weak, spineless coward who believed lies instead of trusting my own heart." But the biggest shock was yet to come. Clara May pulled out one more document, this one with Mr. Whitmore's signature clear as day. "And this, folks, is a contract between Mr. Whitmore and my brother, giving the lawyer 30% of all farm profits in exchange for his legal services in handling Daddy's estate." Samuel jumped up from his chair like his pants were on fire. 30%? Whitmore, you told me it was 5% for standard legal fees. All eyes turned to Mr. Whitmore, who was now sweating bullets and tugging at his collar. The smooth, confident lawyer was gone, replaced by a man who looked like a cornered animal. "Now see here," he sputtered, "these documents could be forgeries themselves. This woman has been gone for 10 years, plenty of time to fabricate." "Mr. Whitmore," Clara May said calmly, "would you like to explain why your signature appears on these fake documents? Or how about the receipt for the printing press you used to forge Daddy's will?" The room went dead silent. You could have heard a feather hit the floor. Whitmore's web of lies was unraveling faster than a cheap sweater, and everybody in that room could see it. The man who'd been respected and trusted for years was revealed as nothing more than a scheming deceiver who destroyed a family for his own profit. But honey, exposing the truth was just the beginning. Now came the hardest part of all, deciding what to do about it. Now honey, what happened next was something that would change every heart in that room forever. After all the truth had been laid bare, after Mr. Whitmore's lies had crumbled like old paper, the whole crowd moved outside to the farmhouse yard, where this whole story had really begun. The evening sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the yard where Clara May had played as a child, where she'd helped her mama hang laundry, where she'd dreamed of her wedding day under the old oak tree. Samuel stood there, looking like a man who'd been struck by lightning. All those years of guilt, all those sleepless nights wondering if he'd done wrong, had finally caught up with him. The brother who'd called himself Colonel and acted so high and mighty was gone, replaced by a broken man who finally saw what his pride had cost him. "Clara May," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But then something happened that nobody expected. Samuel Henderson, the man who'd thrown his own sister out of her home, fell to his knees right there in front of everyone. Tears were streaming down his face, and his whole body was shaking like a leaf in a storm. "Sister, please," he sobbed, "can you ever forgive me? I was such a fool, such a cruel, prideful fool. I believed that lying lawyer over my own flesh and blood. I let greed and fear turn me into someone Daddy would be ashamed of." The crowd was dead silent, watching this powerful man humble himself before the sister he'd wronged. Some folks were crying themselves, seeing such raw emotion, such genuine remorse. Clara May looked down at her brother, this man who'd caused her so much pain, and something beautiful happened in her heart. All that anger, all that hurt she'd carried for 10 years, it just started melting away like ice in the spring sun. "Samuel," she said softly, reaching out to touch his shoulder, "I forgive you." Those 3 words hung in the air like a blessing. Samuel looked up at her, hardly believing what he'd heard. You forgive me, after everything I did to you?" "I forgive you," she repeated, and now tears were streaming down her face too. "Because holding on to anger was hurting me more than it was hurting you." I learned that forgiveness isn't about what you deserve. It's about what I need to be free. The crowd watched in amazement as brother and sister embraced for the first time in 10 years, both of them crying like their hearts would break. But then, Thomas Mitchell stepped forward, trembling like a scared rabbit. The man who'd abandoned Clara May at the altar looked older than his years, worn down by a decade of regret. "Clara May," he said, his voice cracking, "I know I got no right to ask, but can you forgive a coward like me too? I've spent 10 years knowing I was wrong, knowing I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too weak to stand up for what was right." Clara May looked at this man who'd broken her heart, who'd left her standing alone in that wedding dress while the whole town watched. For a moment, the pain of that day came flooding back, the humiliation, the heartbreak, the loneliness. But then she remembered Pastor William's words, "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, child. It's about choosing love over hate." "Thomas," she said, "I forgive you too, but I want you to understand something. I'm not here to go back to what was. I'm here to move forward in peace." The wedding dress that had once been a symbol of shame was now something entirely different. Standing there in the fading sunlight, surrounded by people who finally saw the truth, Clara May looked like what she'd always been, a woman of dignity and grace. The crowd, moved beyond words, began to applaud. Some were weeping openly, touched by the power of forgiveness they'd just witnessed. But even as hearts were being healed and relationships restored, everyone knew there was still one more thing that had to be done. Justice for the man who'd caused it all. Now, honey, the last chapter of Clara May's story is one that'll restore your faith in justice and the power of truth. Because while forgiveness had healed hearts, there was still the matter of making things right in the eyes of the law. Within a week of that dramatic evening, Mr. Whitmore found himself standing before Judge Morrison in the county courthouse, those forged documents spread out on the table like evidence of his black heart. The smooth-talking lawyer who'd fooled everyone for years was finally facing the consequences of his lies. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Morrison said, his voice stern as thunder, "these documents prove you committed fraud, forgery, and theft. You've stolen money from the Henderson family and destroyed lives with your deception." Whitmore tried to maintain his dignity, adjusting his spectacles and clearing his throat, but everyone could see the fear in his eyes. "Your Honor, I maintain my innocence in these matters, but the evidence was overwhelming." Clara May's careful documentation, combined with the real will and those damning letters, painted a picture of calculated greed that no smooth words could explain away. The judge sentenced Whitmore to 5 years in the state penitentiary and ordered him to repay every cent he'd stolen from the Henderson farm. Justice, sweet and long overdue, had finally come. The farm was rightfully restored to Clara May and Samuel as equal partners, just like their daddy had intended. But honey, the greatest inheritance wasn't the land or the money. It was the lesson that had been burned into everyone's hearts. Truth will always triumph over lies, no matter how long it takes. The townspeople who had once whispered about the rejected bride now spoke of Clara May Henderson with respect and admiration. They'd learned what real character looked like, not someone who never falls, but someone who gets back up with grace and forgiveness in their heart. Samuel and Clara May worked together to rebuild not just the farm's prosperity, but their relationship as brother and sister. Every evening they'd sit on that front porch where they'd played as children, planning for the future and healing from the past. "Clara May," Samuel said one sunset evening, "I still can't believe you forgave me after what I did." "Samuel," she replied, rocking gently in Mama's old chair, "holding on to anger would have poisoned my soul. Forgiveness set us both free." Thomas Mitchell, though forgiven, carried the weight of his regret like a stone in his chest for the rest of his days. He never married, spending his life trying to make amends by helping other folks in town whenever they needed it. It was his way of honoring the woman he'd been too cowardly to stand by. The old farmhouse, once a place of shame and heartbreak, became a symbol of redemption and second chances. Folks would bring their troubles to Clara May, knowing she'd listen with wisdom earned through suffering and grace learned through forgiveness. Clara May never did marry. She said she'd found something better than romantic love. She'd found purpose, peace, and the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly who God intended her to be. And that yellowed wedding dress? She kept it hanging in her closet, not as a reminder of pain, but as a testament to the strength that can grow from the deepest heartbreak. Years later, when children would ask about the lady in the big farmhouse who'd returned in a wedding dress, The old-timers would tell them this story. They'd say that in the heart of the American countryside, it was proven once and for all that lies may last 10 years, but forgiveness and truth last forever. Clara May Henderson's story shows us that sometimes the most devastating betrayals can become the foundation for our greatest strength. She didn't just survive her suffering, she transformed it into wisdom, dignity, and an unshakable faith in truth and forgiveness. Her yellowed wedding dress became more than fabric and lace. It became proof that we don't have to let others define our worth or carry the shame of their lies. Sometimes we have to return to the place that broke us, not to relive the pain, but to reclaim our power and show the world who we really are. Questions for reflection. What lies about yourself have you been carrying that aren't even yours to bear? When have you let someone else's cowardice or greed define your worth? What would it look like to return to your own farmhouse, that situation or relationship that hurt you, not for revenge but for truth and healing? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these powerful stories that can change your perspective on life. Click on the video appearing on your screen right now to continue watching more inspiring tales of resilience, forgiveness, and the triumph of the human spirit.